Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Trombley.
And today we're going to be talking about resisting pressure. It's a work by Plutarch, and it's all about how not to cave, how not to be a pushover, and sort of cultivating the character to sort of strike the balance between being someone who is too compliant, too agreeable, versus someone who's maybe too rigid, doesn't care enough about what others think, or doesn't take into account their desires and makes mistakes. So it's really an interesting work, I think, and we're going to cover some items of philosophical interest, but it's a practical work, I would say. You know, he does give rules really for resisting pressure. So we'll go into what he thinks is at the heart of the matter, and then discuss a number of his examples and end with 10 reflections on how to resist pressure. So that's the plan.
Yeah, great. I mean, this was my first time reading Plutarch. You recommended this, Caleb, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, I've read some of his excerpts before because he talks about the Stoics, one of our sources on the Stoics. But reading his philosophy and his approach to philosophy, really enjoyed it. Looking forward to talking about it with you. I think two reasons I enjoyed this is one, I think I am an agreeable person. Like I think I'm not a naturally disagreeable person. So I think if I'm trying to improve my character, this is something that I could do better, which is like, I know what's right in a situation, and I'm not going to cave to pressure, or I'm going to just say what I think. And I'm not going to try to, care as much about what other people feel if they're wrong in the matter. That's something that I want to develop. And this is helpful for that. The other thing I was thinking about reading this, we did a series on the four virtues, and I was originally critical of the virtues because, you take something like courage and it's like, well, how does that help me? I know I'm supposed to be courageous. What am I supposed to do now? But one thing we got out of that series was that when you break them down into smaller parts, they actually become really actionable, almost like training. Like, oh, I'm going to focus on this specific sub virtue right now. And I felt this was kind of the same way. It was nice to reflect on not just, oh, you should be, we spend so much time in Stoicism talking about you should be virtuous. And it's like, it's nice to just I'm just going to spend some time thinking specifically about, not being a pushover, not caving to pressure, like that one specific aspect of your character. How good are you there? When do you fall short? And what are some ways to improve? And that's what this piece did a good job of. And so looking forward to talking about it with you.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think Plutarch's good at drilling into, it's almost a sub virtue of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
And he does a good job talking through examples, a mix of taken from his own life, thought experiments, and also appealing to examples in Greco-Roman history. So I think it's a good mix to get the mix of sort of someone who's grounded in practical examples, history, and philosophy as well.
Mm-hmm.
So just some quick words on Plutarch. He lived from 45 to 120 CE. He was a Platonist philosopher, not a Stoic, I should say. Actually has some works criticizing the Stoics. He's most well known for writing Parallel Lives, which is a set of, you could think of it almost as moral biographies that paired Greek and Roman figures together and rated them on their virtue and vices. So it's a very interesting work. We've spoken about this before on the podcast, or at least I've spoken to a fellow named Alex Petkas, who has a podcast called The Cost of Glory, where he covers Plutarch's Parallel Lives in depth. So I definitely recommend that work. I'm sure we'll cover some pieces from Plutarch from that book in the future as well, but I recommend that work specifically, and Alex's podcast in particular, if you want to dive into that. But yeah, so let's talk about, I suppose, what he sees as sort of the vice that he's aiming to combat, and then dive into some of his examples. So at the very beginning, he contrasts the shameless person with the pushover. And he says, this shameless person is someone who's untroubled by making a mistake, whereas the pushover is someone who's highly sensitive to even the appearance of a shameful action. And this is a direct quote. It's coming from Michael Fontaine's translation, which is collected in How to Have Willpower. And it's this trait of sensitivity, hypersensitivity, oversensitivity to making a mistake that he sort of sees as being at the root of being a pushover. It's an oversensitivity to shame. And on one hand, you shouldn't totally ignore shame. We have some aspects. We had an episode on self-respect, and I don't think you shouldn't make the mistake of not having any self-respect or failing to judge yourself when you make mistakes. And on the other side, you shouldn't be too sensitive to thinking, oh, I made a mistake, or oh, I don't want to step on someone else's toes, or I don't want to do wrong to this person. And these are taken alone legitimate concerns, perhaps, but if you're hypersensitive to that, you will be a pushover. In short, the translation I have, Michael Fontaine leaves this term dysopia, which is an oversensitivity to shame, untranslated, which I think is useful because perhaps there's not a good specific word for it in English. But this is what he sees as being at the root of the vice of being a pushover, essentially, of caving.
I mean, I like that way of putting it as the oversensitivity to shame. I mean, it strikes me as very Aristotelian, kind of golden mean. It's just like, be ashamed about the things that deserve shame. But, if you stand up for yourself, or if you say how you feel, or if you tell someone no, and then you start to feel embarrassed because that makes them unhappy, or because they're disappointed in you or something like this, that's like an inappropriate shame. That's not actually deserving of shame. And so that's the oversensitivity. It's like feeling it when it's not appropriate versus the shameless person who doesn't feel it when it is appropriate. Which is, yeah, it seems very Aristotelian about you're going the wrong way either side, and this is about feeling too much shame.
Mm-hmm. There's a nice example he gives, and he's really mindful of this sort of balance, I think, noting Aristotle's, I think, perfectly appropriate, the sort of balance between not being shameless versus hypersensitivity. And he gives a nice example of a therapist is ridding a teenage soul of malice. This teenager is developing some vice, perhaps, and when he applies a pointed remark to a delicate and tender part of the soul, though such as the part that causes feelings of awkwardness and turns us into pushovers, he's careful not to accidentally cut all sense of shame out along with it. I like this because it's sort of, you imagine maybe therapist, coach, what have you. They're working with someone, and they're making a remark like you're better than this or something like this, and you're trying to appeal to the person's sense of shame, self-respect, to motivate them to act better. But at the same time, he says you need to be careful not to accidentally cut out all sense of shame out along with it, because I don't know, many listeners are familiar with, if you criticize someone too much, then it's just going to be rational for them to double down, not feel any shame. So there's sort of a balance there when you're dealing with others, and when you're dealing with yourself.
Yeah, it makes me also think of like the radical acceptance or toxic positivity, or this idea of, whatever you like is fine, whoever you are is great. You just need to love yourself, and that's that kind of, maybe that's not what that example is meaning, but I see that also as like cutting out this idea of shame, where it's like, you don't want the person hating themselves and being too insecure, but also you don't want it to be like everything you do is beautiful and you're special and there's nothing wrong with you, because that's just not realistic or accurate either. Shame has that important, you hit on that at the start of the conversation, it has that important stoic, it's an important stoic tool for behavioral improvement. I think of shame, at least in Epictetus's way of putting that, it's that gap between who you are and who you could be, or who you should be. Um, and that's natural to feel, because the Stoics think we have some sort of natural, there is a kind of natural way we should be. We should be rational. We should be kind to others. We should be seeking the truth. And when you fall short of that target, it's natural or healthy to feel that shame. So that's what it makes me think of when it's like cutting out. You don't want to just throw out the baby with the bathwater there.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. He cites a line from Homer: "Shame which does men both great harm and great help." So I think that's sort of pointing at this idea. And you also note, you can be more specific about different types of shame, distinguishing a healthy sense of shame. I think I like to think of that as self-respect from dysopia or this unhealthy
Mm-hmm.
sense of shame. But you can also think of the level, shame. Well, that's something that can be useful, but also can be a great harm.
Yeah, it's interesting there with you think of it as self-respect. I mean, because that's a very Aristotelian thing to do. Is like you call every level something different. It's not like it's not like shameless, shameful. The middle state kind of has its own term, which can be helpful for conceptually differentiating it. So I like self-respect as an idea. But when I think of this, I think of even just like a conscience, that like folk psychology idea of just like, oh, I kind of like feel embarrassed that I did that crappy thing that I didn't have to do. And it's like, so
Yeah.
for me, when I think of shameless, it's like, you don't have a conscience. You're just like, oh, I'm not holding myself to any sort of standard. Whatever I do becomes the standard of goodness. And then this dysopia is just this kind of constant, um, well, I don't know. It's maybe not even wallowing. It's like caving early because you don't want the risk of wallowing, or caving early because you don't want you're so sensitive to shame, you're not feeling it too much, you're trying to avoid the situation, and so you're being a pushover, you're trying to avoid the conflict.
So Plutarch, we should talk about some examples. And as I said earlier, he gives some great sort of mythical examples, some historical ones, and then he moves on to, how are ways that you can cultivate a disposition to resist pressure. And that's where he, dives into some of the ones, examples we'd face in our day-to-day lives. But I do like, his mythical and historical examples as well. About it really touches on two episodes we've talked about before, but not too often. But we've touched on them each for one episode. He talks about Creon and Medea. So we have an episode on Seneca's version of Medea, and there's a specific part in that play where Creon is going to exile Medea, send her away, and Medea asks, for more time before she is immediately banished from the city. And Creon essentially caves in. I mean, it's the sort of reasons, I think it's an additional day or something of this sort. And that is a mistake. Plutarch's line on this is, yeah, Plutarch's line on this is nice. He says he gave sage advice to others, but succumbed to pressure himself. And by granting her request for a day's reprieve, he destroyed his world. And yeah, for those who are unfamiliar, Medea goes on to commit horrendous deeds towards her children and murders Creon's daughter. That's it was clearly a mistake, even though you can see how someone might reason to sort of justify that decision. It's a difficult decision to exile Medea. Perhaps you can see cases where maybe you want to take off the band-aid a little bit more slowly, and that's what Creon is convinced to do, but it turns out terribly.
Yeah, so is this, I think that's a great example. Is this just like avoiding awkward conversations, or is there a bit more nuance to it? Like it's almost like, because when I think of avoiding awkward conversations, I guess I'm trying to think of what's the, because we all have that experience, you're I mean, you and I both do jiu-jitsu, and there's kind of like the guy that smells, and you don't want to tell the guy that he smells, even though you probably should, and you're just kind of avoiding, you're avoiding that conflict. um is it just like being uncomfortable with doing what's right because it's going to make someone else sad, or what? Yeah, what would be the more technical, it has to do with shame, but what would be the
Mhm.
kind of more technical way of thinking about it on an interaction by interaction basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I suppose the way I see it is it does have to do with, at the first level, conflict avoidance, or not wanting to say something that makes someone unnecessarily feel bad or what have you. And I think what Plutarch wants to say is essentially you're sensitive to violating a norm. Maybe in Creon's case, treating Medea unfairly. You don't want to be unfair, and perhaps also you don't want to be seen as someone who
Hmm.
acts in an unjust manner. So I think it's both of those factors matter. How other people see you, and also are you following the right norms? And then it becomes perhaps a preoccupation, and turns to shame, because you will think worse of yourself if in fact you do violate these norms. You have a preoccupation on perhaps on how other people see you as someone who upholds justice. In the case of Creon, is a fair ruler, and to the while ignoring, and this is perhaps where these points about a balance comes in. Some other Aristotelian points about the other virtues, while ignoring other matters
Hmm.
that are crucial in the situation at hand. It becomes a preoccupation instead of just something that's, decision relevant, one factor among many.
Ah, that makes sense. Okay, yeah. So there's a bunch of different things that you're balancing, and if violating the social norm becomes the number one thing that overrides the other considerations, I think of this in terms of, if somebody's making you uncomfortable at a party, and you're not willing to be like, hey, like, just stop talking to me, or like, leave me alone, or stop flirting with me. And it's like, you're afraid, I guess you're like afraid of making a scene almost, that kind of, you don't want to be like embarrassed that way. I was also thinking of the example in the horror movies. I think there's this trope in horror movies where, the somebody's like invading your space, but you're not really willing to tell them to leave or go away, or like, why didn't they just leave the situation? But there's this like kind of norm or pressure to stay and not to make a big deal, and then it ends
Mhm.
up with everybody getting killed. And that's kind of this vice in practice. I think that's a fun example if it tracks.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great example. The other examples Plutarch notes from historical cases are the example of Dion and Calippus. We talked about Dion when we had the episode on Plato. Was a student of Plato's, a rival of Dionysius of Syracuse. But to cut a long story short, he didn't take protective measures against Calippus. They are both students of Plato, both friends of Plato, but political rivals as well. But Plutarch says, Dion didn't want to be seen as, protecting himself, communicating they didn't trust Calippus, and as such, he shouldn't have trusted Calippus because he was assassinated. And he also lists the example. You don't need to go into it too long, but there's so many examples of in history of figures getting invited to a dinner. They don't want to be seen as rude. They go to the dinner, and perhaps they don't want to. Again, related to this Dion and Calippus example, they don't want to be seen as snubbing their host in any way, or communicating they don't trust their host, so they don't go with the right security detail that they should, and then they are murdered. And I think that's a extreme example, but you're bringing that's really the same example as your party, really. Not wanting
Yeah.
to seem rude at the party, getting that invitation, and maybe or stay, people. I'm thinking of classic case of someone trying to convince you to stay out later than you should, or something. Like, what's the big deal? You really,
Yeah.
do
You
you
don't want
really
to
think
seem
that
lame. You don't want to
yeah,
seem,
exactly.
I'm thinking of the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones is one of these, the murdered at dinner situations. And I'm reading the Odyssey right now, and this is how Agamemnon dies. He gets invited for dinner, and then killed, if I'm remembering properly. Um, which is another example. It's a famous Greek trope, probably because it happened quite a bit, where they're pressuring you with social norms. So you don't bring weapons, bodyguards, as you were saying, and then you get taken advantage of.
Hmm. And I think this is where the point about balance or preoccupation is also so important, because sometimes you shouldn't, bring that extra security detail, right? So,
Yes.
sometimes it is a good idea to trust the other person. And, but, Plutarch's point is that you don't want to cave into pressure. You don't want to make that decision for the wrong reasons.
Um, like part of it's not caving to peer pressure. This is where I just want to emphasize that this is where the balance is really important. Because one way you could say is just you could just say it's not caving to peer pressure. It's just doing what you think is right in every situation. And Plutarch is saying, no, no, social convention matters. We should listen to social convention. We should pay attention to social convention. To insult somebody without a good reason is not what a good person is like. It's just it's that overemphasis, that preoccupation with not upsetting anybody, with not making a scene, with not causing conflict in a way that breaks a norm. That you know, when the danger, the risk, the compromise of your values should outweigh the social faux pas, and you still choose not to make the social faux pas. That's the error. Not being attuned to social norms. Plutarch's still advocating for that. It's just overemphasizing that. I imagine this like the kind of, I mean, you can imagine this vice very sympathetically when you think of yourself and the situations you felt pressured to do things and kind of forgive yourself. But maybe you can also imagine it in the kind of socialite, or the person who's always putting that kind of social convention at the front of what they do, how they act, who they associate with. And they end up associating with bad people, or bad things happen in their presence, and it's like, yeah, you've kind of got a distorted perception of priorities in that case.
Absolutely. So then the question arises, how do you become someone who doesn't cave into pressure? And here Plutarch gives us um, some advice. And this advice starts with starting small. He says we can start as people practicing anything do with little incidents that aren't too hard to face. And he gives a number of examples. It's interesting how, for the most part, modern these examples could be things like rejecting social drinking, either entirely or perhaps, not having too much, setting a limit for how much you are going to drink, even when other people, they're just about to toast, just have that other round, what have you. He also lists not gambling while drinking, which is perhaps a general rule, a good rule in general, regardless of concerns about dysopia. And then also suggests not suffering fools in sort of ordinary situations. Sort of, there's always there's definitely going to be a balance here, but um, not being preoccupied with seeming nice, essentially, but knowing, if it's your role in a particular situation to, perhaps get some outcome at work or something like that. That's what you're focused on, and of course, treating others well, but not wasting time or letting others make mistakes when you're simply, preoccupied with perhaps not seeming like someone who is, not fun to be around or something like this, something that's irrelevant to the role at hand.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that these are really contemporary examples. The other thing that they make me think is that I just like respect these people. It's like an interesting thing. I mean, I see this kind of middle ground quality. The people who don't, who can be respectfully like, no, I'm just not drinking. Like, thank you, and can kind of like respectfully stand up for themselves. It's just something that I really admire.
Hmm.
The other thing I thought about these is, it reminds me so much of Epictetus, who talks about when you're working on, dealing with desire, you start small, the same kind of thing. And it just, um, well, it reminds me, so I think sometimes we think about the cultivation of virtue as some sort of, I don't know, ethereal, philosophical, like a skill, like it exists in some sort of higher plane. And the point here is just very similar of like, you go for short runs, You do that, then you go for medium length runs, then you go for longer runs. It's just back to the craft analogy. Like you just lift the weight that you can safely lift, and then you start lifting a bit more. And so
Mhm.
I love when the philosophers are just like, yeah, you just do just do it in simple, easy situations, and it will get better. You'll get better at it, and you'll be able to do it in harder situations. I love that reminder and insight even from Plutarch.
Yeah, I think it's a great strategy. He also mentions that another way one could practice is by not applauding bad performances. And think about someone who compliments everything they have, and maybe I think there's gonna be a kind of positivity in that, but sometimes those compliments are empty, right? And maybe if you are that kind of person, maybe you don't need to do that a lot of the time, and that'd be one way to practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was another thing I was thinking about was like feedback. I don't know. My work talks a lot about feedback and the importance of giving honest, constructive feedback. And it's almost like I think there's this social convention around not criticizing people, but then giving good feedback is exactly requires criticism. And so that's when you're talking about competing interests, because you have that interest of like social convention, but then you have that person's interest of wanting to get better or improving. And it's like if you allow the social convention, that uncomfortable, like you're going to harm the other person because you feel uncomfortable criticizing them. It's a
Hmm.
great example of it, uh, it's a great example of this dystopia of like um, you're harming them, you're harming yourself because you're just uncomfortable with this idea that you're breaking this convention that you've been habituated to.
Yeah, that's a good example. And it also points to there's a skill in giving good feedback. Plutarch in a number of cases mentions that you need to have social tact. It's not,
Hmm.
you can't, depending on the situation, of course, but you could say the same thing well, or you can say it poorly. And, Plutarch notes that often it's useful to use humor or, treat people who are maybe higher status than you by appealing to their guilt in some cases, or self-conception is maybe a better way to put it. I thought you were better than this, or something of that sort. Maybe using humor more with people who are lower status than you is something he says. He has a nice example where, a cynic is asking some king for money, and he asks him for $50. And the king says, that's not a gift that kings grant. It's too small. And then the man says, the cynic philosopher says, give me 250K. And the king responds, that's not a gift that cynics receive, which is nice. It's a nice line, nice quip. Um, I don't know if you ever listened to the comedian Bill Burr, but he has a story where he talks about meeting the Leonardo DiCaprio, and it's a short story where he is introduced to Leonardo by a friend, and the friend says something like that at some event, and this is Bill Burr, the comic, and Leonardo just responded with, "I'm familiar with his work," and Bill Burr says something like, at that moment he at once validated me, communicated respect in the way he said it, and also communicated that he had no interest in talking with me at that time. And I recognized that, and we moved on, and I walked away feeling great. And he's like, it's just some sort of verbal jujitsu, if you will, being able to communicate something like that just in the manner of your speech without being, a completely rude. Effectively Leonardo blew him off, but did it in a tactful way. So I think that's something that Plutarch harps on in a number of his examples is just because you are resisting the pressure others are applying on you doesn't mean it's appropriate to respond in a sort of
Hmm.
socially unaware type way.
Well, I think that's a great example, and I think of what a skill. It's a skill that crosses all kinds of, I don't know, levels of wealth or power. Like this skill from a relatively junior, less senior person in a company or in a social group, there's different kinds of pressures that and social convention that gets placed on you, and that's when you have to reject social drinking or say no to peer pressure and say I'm going to still conform to this group. I'm still going to want to be a part of it, but I'm not going to like compromise myself. Um, that's one way of doing it. That's a skill. And then I was thinking about how much you must have to get good at this as a celebrity when you're giving that
Right, right.
Leonardo DiCaprio story. If you're Marcus Aurelius, you've got to be an expert at people are asking you for things all the time. They're expecting things of you, and you would become so cynical and angry about social interaction, or you would just become super good at this of like, I'm gonna, that was that. I guess that jujitsu part is like he's not really breaking social convention because he's almost like he's breaking social convention in one way where he's not like, oh my God, Bill, so nice to meet you. Wow, amazing. Which is like the
Mhm.
dinner party, like dinner party introduction convention. But he's still socially passing. It's like that, that middle ground about like,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't want to do that. So I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to figure out a social out of this situation that doesn't make people uncomfortable.
Mhm. Another point here too, I think, is that if you as you get better at this skill, it becomes easier to practice. So I think that's something to keep in mind. If you are hypersensitive, then you can work on. If you're hypersensitive to violating social norms, you can work on violating these sorts of social norms a little bit more. Changing your attitude towards that. Seeing it as not just harming yourself but harming others. Failing to give good feedback. That's a good example. But also, you can work on giving feedback without in an excellent way, and then I think you have less of a concern about
Yeah.
the violation of social norms.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's harder the worse you are at it.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
totally.
a bit of a puzzle. So towards the end, in my translation, at any rate, Michael Fontaine lists 10 reflections. Maybe useful to go through the end, go through each of these. We've touched on some of these already, but Plutarch notes that when it comes to resisting pressure, we should keep these things in mind. First, caving exacerbates problems. It's sort of a classic case of caving is easier now, but of course becomes evidently a mistake later on. And I think all our examples capture that. We all have examples from our own life that communicate that. Second point, silence is often an effective response. If you, especially in certain cases where you might be wary to respond or not exactly know how to respond, sometimes silence is an option. Silence is fine.
Well,
Through them.
I think that caving exacerbates problems one is the key one because what's the difference between respecting social convention and caving to social convention? I think it's when you've chosen not the best option, like you've made a mistake, and so I love that idea. Like, what's the idea? What's the difference between going along with norms and caving? If things got worse, and you probably if you realized things were going to get worse is probably another piece to it, then you caved. If you realized it wasn't the right thing to do and you did it anyway, that's caving. So I think that's a really important one.
Yeah, I think so. And the silence one is most useful perhaps when you're in more of a bullying type situation. Someone's really trying to pressure you to do something, and maybe walking away, silence. I think that's when it's most useful. In other cases, he notes quote famous sayings and quips to ease the delivery of your no, as it were. That can work. I think it ties in general to the being humorous, having tact.
Yeah, I
Giving.
mean, well, it's the $50 isn't enough for a king to give, and $250 is too much for a cynic to ask for. It's just a funny way of saying no, right? We talk about that Diogenes line where um, where Alexander the Great is like, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes says, "Yeah, you can step aside because you're blocking the sun." Everybody has a big laugh about it. Everyone's like, "Oh, Diogenes, you're so cool." Where Diogenes was basically like, no, king, I don't want anything from you, which is kind of can be offensive, right? It's just wit. I don't know how practical of a thing tool that is, because if you're not a witty person, it might be more difficult for you. But maybe the idea is like you can cut the tension with some humor. This is an important point, or with just with an intelligent phrase. Then it's harder said than done. But if you're intelligent, I guess keep using it, or like witty, keep using it.
Yeah, yeah. We don't live it in as much as a of at least American culture. There's not, we're not quoting Hesiod or Homer too often, but you can try it. But the examples from movies or comics that might work well. Um, Related to this, employ irony as needed when offering a recommendation. Sort of in the funny case where someone's asked to recommend someone, but you maybe, you're in the position where that person perhaps doesn't deserve that recommendation. But at the same time, it would be inopportune to reject giving them a recommendation. That can be appropriate sometimes, I suppose, but I'm not sure how useful of a general rule that is.
I think it's the same kind of idea as the saying in quip. It's like cutting the tension.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Another reflection: regret is instantaneous, so swallow your false pride. I think that just connects to caving, exacerbates problems. Initially, perhaps the caving is tempting, but shortly it will be seen to be a mistake.
Hmm.
Um, Using humor to decline an inappropriate request from below. We've discussed that a decent amount. Perhaps the only other bit to add to that is, Plutarch's sensitive to some of these social dynamics. Who's below you, who's above you, and that's something that is going to shape, what sorts of responses are, what kinds of humor is, ideal. If someone's below you in a work type situation, perhaps it wouldn't be appropriate to joke about firing them or something of this sort, but in other cases it would be.
Hmm.
uh, Related to this, he says guilt trip and highlight inappropriate requests from above. The next one we haven't touched as much. So the next three we have addicts show us what true resistance to pressure looks like. I think this is always a nice thought. If you feel like you have to give in, thinking about the ability of some people to act almost shamelessly, at least without any hint of dysopia, in pursuit of whatever their addiction is.
Yeah, it's
And I
almost
think,
like a
go ahead.
contemplation of the sage exercise, but it wouldn't be a sage, but it's like it's like, what does this look like in the extreme? Yeah, it's a great example.
Yeah, it's an existence proof that
Hmm.
it's you're not forced to give in. I think this
Humans
is
have
the
the
idea.
capability of doing this.
Hmm.
You have the capability of doing this. You don't want to be acting like an addict in terms of being persistent and pushing through all social norms, but people have the capacity to do that. And so, why are you not doing that? Well, says something about the way you're evaluating social norms and shame. And then, as you said, once you have the existence proof that this is not like natural or necessary, then it becomes your responsibility about where you want to land on that continuum.
Hmm. Absolutely. His next reflection: welcome criticism from bullies. I think this is a good reminder. I think this is a good point because it's sort of the other side of the coin of all this, which is being able to take criticism, perhaps being able to take the violation of social norms when it's done to you, and sort of using criticism as something to sift through, see what's true in it, disregard whatever isn't, and then move forward.
So, is the idea here? I mean, there's kind of two ideas there. One is, listen to mean things people say about you, even if you don't like them, because there might be something good in that criticism, something you can benefit from. But there's another idea there, which was, don't be so don't be so sensitive when people violate norms around you either. Like just kind of lower your sensitivity to these things. Try to make don't have it be over exaggerated how bad the thing you did was when you stood up for yourself, but don't over exaggerate how bad it is when other people break these norms. So it's kind of is it both those points?
Yeah, I think it's both those points, but it's especially this idea around sort of building a thicker skin, I suppose.
Hmm.
And he quotes Pericles, who says, "He who incurs hatred for the hardest decisions makes good decisions."
Hmm.
Um, there's a line from the Rudyard Kipling poem "If," which goes something like, "If you can keep your head when all around you doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too," which I think communicates this principle of, being able to be solid, keep your head when others are criticizing you, while focusing on making decisions, making allowance for whatever their doubts are too, if they're relevant.
Hmm. Yeah, good point.
Last one. Memory is the best antidote to caving in. A good focus on uh, knowledge, using memory as motivation to not give in. And, I think a good case to end these reflections.
It's just like think about how bad it sucked last time, and use that for motivation.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's two personal examples I thought of when we're going through these reflections. I guess one is like a good example and one's a bad example. A bad or an example of doing it poorly. Both are good examples. One is an example of doing it well. One is an example of doing it poorly. The poor doing it poorly, caving. I imagine, that person you want to break up with, but you just don't want to have that difficult conversation, or you just don't want to have that breakup conversation. And so there's this kind of avoidance of, there's breaking that. I don't know if that's a good example because I don't know if it's a social norm. Maybe that's just conflict avoidance. But I think of that of kind of you're harming both of you by keeping up this facade because you're not willing
Hmm.
to have that hard conversation. That's an example I think of when you could use this skill. An example of when I've seen this skill done well. I remember I was at work and I started working for a new company, and there was maybe three of or four of us in a meeting, and a junior person made a sexist joke, and the senior person in the room was just like, "We just don't make those kind of jokes here. Like we just don't make sexist jokes at work." And it wasn't in like okay, this person's getting fired or the whole thing's being blown up out of proportion. It was just like a really clear standard setting at the expense of the clapping at the bad performance example, right? Like it was like, oh, somebody makes a joke, you're supposed to laugh. Even if you think the joke is bad, you're supposed to smile and laugh and move on. And it was just like, oh, I'm going to break that norm and kind of clarify something here. And it was just an example of not caving that I thought really helped set the tone moving forward. So that's an example of what we're aiming for, as I understand it.
Yeah, good examples. Great examples. If I were to sum up this work in rules, I was thinking about this towards the end. What would the sort of the rules be you could take away from this heuristics, rules of thumb? Perhaps, always choosing the best option, which seems perhaps not, despite the first pass, seem not so useful, but I think it's a reminder that dysopia is hypersensitivity to shame, and it's thinking about, you know, where might I be making a mistake, or maybe I shouldn't do this because it'd be offensive, instead of just thinking about what's the best thing to do here, and having that being forefront of mind. We talked about starting small, just sort of as a practice, thinking about those social situations that are easier to build up a thicker skin, what have you. Practice not giving into pressure. A reminder to act with tact. I suppose ultimately it's a mix. It's a way to respect others. How you give, how you treat them, of course, how you give feedback, how you do things that may violate these social norms. And then, of course, the last rule is, don't give in when you shouldn't.
I think those are great rules. At the risk of like, I think it's a great way to end. But when I think about act with tact, that's just this idea. If you're breaking social norm A, you don't need to break social norm B, C, D, E either. You don't need to throw them all out. Like, just break the one that you're breaking on purpose, and don't be just this careless, thoughtless person and throw out the other ones. Give people an out. Give people opportunities to save face. Things like this. And I love the always choose the best option thing, because that's ultimately the Stoic answer. Is you're always trying to choose the best option, and then when we look at vice, it's just different kinds of ignorance, different kinds of reasons we move away from the best option. And you could miss the best option because you're shameless, like we talked about the start of this episode. You could miss the best option for a lot of reasons, but now this is just focusing on one reason people don't do the best thing, which is because they're worried about breaking social convention. They're worried about doing something embarrassing. And this was just a fun philosophical reminder of pushing through that, and the importance of focusing on that if that's something you're working on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd certainly recommend this work to others. I think it's one I'll revisit throughout my life. It's not too long, but I think it's deep and useful. There's the translation by Michael Fontaine that I mentioned, but also I think it's a Loeb translation, which is translated as on compliancy, which I think is good as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the recommendation.
Awesome. Anything else?
No, that was great. I'm going to start working on it. Start small.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you found this conversation useful, please give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you use, and share it with a friend. And I'd like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. Do check out his work at ancientlyre.com, and please get in touch with us at stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback or questions. Until next time.